Hello! I've been staring at Call the Midwife images and videos for an atrocious amount of time, and thought I would share what I found. This will be discussing the uniform for the midwives starting in Series or Season 5, the version with the shawl collar on a V-neck button-down dress. Most of the nurses have the same uniform dress, with the exception of Nurse Crane, who wears a higher neckline with a different style collar, and later Nurse Corrigan, who has a few tweaks to account for her figure. The dress appears to be a blue chambray, probably cotton or linen as it would need to stand up to laundering for real-life use, but not as much laundering within the confines of the show. The collar appears to be pure white. Historically, I believe the collar would have been made to be removed and reinstalled easily, so it could be bleached or replaced when needed. The same applies to the cuffs, although I will not be creating mine that way. The dress looks to be buttoned down the entire length of the dress, but the buttons flip from being visible to hidden at the waistline. The bodice buttons are visible, and the skirt buttons are hidden. There is still a clear opening for the skirt front, so I believe the buttons do continue, especially as some pictures in A Labor of Love show the bottom hem split at the center front. Look towards Trixie's knees here. It's also possible that there are two different versions, one that opens the entire length, and one where the buttons stop below the hip and the center front is seamed for the rest of the length. The bodice buttons appear to be fabric covered to exactly match the dresses, but concave at the center. From some of the book images, I believe that there is a small stitch near the center of the button to keep the fabric concave. You could probably make do with a well-matched blue plastic 4-hole button instead, if needed. The dresses are princess seamed from the shoulders, with what appears to be 3 sections coming from the shoulder and 2 below the red trim. The first section runs from the front button or buttonhole placket to the edge of the red trim at the lower shoulder. The second section matches the edges of the trim, and the third runs from the outer edge of the trim to the armhole and side seam. Below the trim, there is either a princess seam or a dart that extends to the waist from the center of the trim. In Nurse Corrigan's case, it also appears to include a pleat that opens up to allow more room for the butt. Speaking of the trim on the lower shoulder, that trim is actually on the upper edge of a small pocket on both sides. I believe the pocket is for ease of pinning on the apron without having to open up the dress. It doesn't appear to be extremely large, likely just big enough to deal with a safety pin inside. The dress does not appear to have a separate bodice and skirt, but instead the pieces are full length. The skirt pockets are also trimmed with the same red fabric as the bodice pockets, but they are an overlay style, not set into the seams. They appear to be very generous pockets with the size of the bags of barley sugar Nurse Crane carries around on top of anything else in her pocket. The pockets seem to run the width of one panel of the skirt. The skirt is not as full as a true circle skirt, but it is still reasonably voluminous. It appears to be hemmed to below the knee on each actress. The sleeves are a fairly straightforward set-in sleeve with slight gathers at the top. They run to just above the elbow. The white cuffs in the show are an even height all the way around. But I found historical examples that came to a point on the outside of the arm and others that were split on the outside of the arm, probably for ease of movement. Either one would be quite lovely. The belt would be a blue woven ribbon traditionally, but you could probably get away with a wide elastic belt for comfort. The buckle is unique for each character on the show, as it was something they would have either received as a gift or bought to celebrate becoming a nurse. You can find vintage and antique buckles on multiple sites, or you could purchase something with a simple clasp that is good enough for most cases. Each nurse has a watch pinned to her bodice near the upper pocket. Sometimes it is neatly above, occasionally below, and probably pinned into the pocket. The face of the watch would appear upside down if you looked at it face on, but it's perfect for the nurse to flip up and look at when timing something. The badges on the other side of the bodice are representative of the letters after the nurse's name. If you remember, Nurse Crane introduced herself with an entire alphabet after her name. The taller, oval pin indicates that the wearer is a state-certified midwife. The center of the pin is either silver or gold, depending on when the pin was issued, and has an image of Juno Lucina, representing the Roman goddess Juno in her aspect as the goddess of childbirth. The blue section contains the words state-certified midwife. The more circular pin indicates that the wearer is a nurse. The center has an image of Hygeia, the Greek goddess of good health. She has daffodils and sheaves around her to represent Wales. The pin itself is a rose shape to represent England. The blue circle contains the words General Nursing Council for England and Wales. The pin may have a safety chain and pin, but it also may not. Together, these two badges represent the fact that the patients can have confidence that the nurses know what they're doing and have been trained for it. The pins used on the show are believed to be authentic and possibly borrowed from retired midwives or purchased from retail sites. The apron is fairly straightforward. We are able to see that it has deep overlaps around the top and sides, likely to keep it stronger for pinning and to add structure. There may also be interfacing there to help with that. The skirt of the pinafore wraps considerably farther around the skirt of the dress than I expected. The bodice of the pinafore looks to be pleated to the waistband, which is supported by some historical images as well. I did not find a lot of evidence on the back of the apron, but if we operate on the assumption that the nuns and nurses pull from the same stack of aprons, there appear to be fasteners on the waistband. I plan to use a slide bar for my fastener. The skirt of the apron appears to be wider at the bottom than the top, and I do see what looks like evidence of pleats or darts at the backside where it's sewn to the waistband. As the point of the pinafore was to save the dress from any messes, I planned to make mine slightly longer than the dress. There is some evidence for this in pictures from the era. The one detail I'm not certain about is if there would be openings to access the nurse's pockets or not. I could see an argument for either direction and can't find evidence in the pictures I've found thus far. I'm inclined to have an opening, but have quite a bit of overlap to make sure the dress would stay protected while still allowing pocket access if it was needed. We don't always have a good view of the nurse's shoes. I was mostly focused on Sheila Turner when I was looking at shoes, and the pictures I've been able to find seem to show a flat or low-heeled black Oxford lace-up. I think brown could also work, potentially, as it was shown in earlier seasons with the old dress on some of the nurses. The nurses almost always have their legs covered. The exception is the episodes set in South Africa, where they're wearing ankle socks. For warmer weather, when set in England, it appears to be nude or sheer black nylon. For colder weather, it would be appropriate historically for a thicker solid black wool or cotton to be used. The red cardigan used in the show appears to have been made for each nurse individually, as it fits each of them differently. Some of them are more cropped, while others come to the lower hip. They all share design elements, though. They're a deep V-neck cardigan with buttons starting below the bust. They have set-in sleeves, much like the dresses do. The cuffs are ribbed and quite long, as they're frequently shown folded up. The bottom of most of the cardigans also appear to have a similar length of ribbing to the cuffs. I believe these sweaters are hand-knit, and may be the same sweater pattern from the earlier seasons. Some of the later seasons show the V-necks starting higher so that if the cardigan was buttoned, it would perfectly frame the shawl collar of the dresses. Moving on to the hat. I'll be discussing the red gathered hat with the fold-up brim, as that's the one I like the most. Note that this is not the same as the red pillbox hat either. It appears to be a fairly basic circular top gathered into a firm band with two crescent-shaped brims that overlap at the sides. I have found one picture that appears to be a slightly different style, but within the same scene it flips back to the style that overlaps at the side. I think this errant hat is just a slightly strange perspective on the crossed crescent. The hats also have a fabric badge similar to the midwife pin badge. I found an example of what this likely looks like. The blue hat pictured is a vintage cap that the red hats may have been modeled from. The episodes set on cooler days also feature a nurse's cape. The cape is likely gray suiting, possibly twill, and has a burgundy lining. All slits have a pretty deep overlap to keep the cold out when they aren't in use, and they are up high enough to allow for the arms to come out and use the bicycle easily. They are fastened with straps that run over one shoulder and under the opposite arm, creating an X on the front of the body. They also have buttons to be able to close the front of the cape if it is cold enough to require it. They do have a collar, but they do not seem to have a hood. These capes are based off of existing nurses' capes from the 1940s and 50s. We also see Nurse Crane wearing a cape very similar to these when she is introduced. Now the midwife's bag. I'll be talking about the new blue bags that were introduced, as I think they are simply beautiful. I believe the show likely commissioned these to be like some vintage fabric-covered aluminum cases. I was not able to find anything brand new that was precisely the same, so I opted to get a navy blue camera bag that's reminiscent of the style without being exact. I hope that these details are helpful to you. I enjoyed going through all these images to try to really understand what was going on.